Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive with us. Today, we're going to be talking about something that I think we all struggle with, and that's procrastination. And we're going to be looking at a book called Do the Hard Things First by Scott Allen. We've got some excerpts that you sent over, and we're going to be diving deep into them and hopefully come away with some actionable insights.
Yeah, I love that this book focuses on the psychology of procrastination first. It kind of digs into the why before it jumps into solutions, which I think can be really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what really stood out to me while I was reading this were Alan's examples. Like he talks about this one time that he put off paying a simple bill and ended up having his credit cards canceled. I mean, haven't we all been there at some point or another?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a great illustration of how procrastination, even in small doses, can kind of snowball into bigger problems. And that's a big part of what he emphasizes in the book is, owning our actions and recognizing that procrastination does come with a price tag, whether that's damage to our self-esteem or missed opportunities. It's not something we always consider in the moment.
Right. It's like we think we're getting away with something, but there's always that bill that comes due eventually.
Yeah.
So let's break this down a bit. How does a book actually define procrastination? I mean, is it just a fancy word for laziness?
Not quite. Alan describes it as the act of putting things off, usually tasks that we find unpleasant. And we kind of trick ourselves into thinking that we're getting away with something. But as we just talked about, there's always a price to pay later on.
Right. It's like hitting the snooze button on life.
Yeah.
But eventually that alarm's going to go off.
Exactly. And he digs into how procrastination can actually be a coping mechanism. It's easier to, distract ourselves, deny the task exists, or come up with excuses than to just face the music.
Oh, I am the queen of excuses. I'm too busy. I'll do it later. The list goes on and on. But there's this really interesting point that Alan makes about the language that we use.
Oh, yeah. He talks about how the words we use can actually reinforce these patterns. So instead of saying oh, I'm such a procrastinator, try reframing it to I'm an action taker. It's about shifting your mindset even before you tackle the task.
Oh, I love that. It's like giving yourself a little pep talk before you even begin. But what about the deeper reasons behind procrastination? Sometimes it feels like it's more than just avoiding something we don't want to do.
That's where things get really interesting. Alan identifies 4 main fears that he says are kind of at the root of procrastination. Fear of commitment, fear of the unknown, fear of discomfort, and even fear of making decisions.
Wow, those are some pretty heavy hitters. No wonder we try to avoid them.
Exactly, and he uses this really great example in the book about a woman named Debbie. She stayed in a bad relationship for years just because she was terrified of the unknown, of what it would be like to be alone. It's a powerful example of how fear can really paralyze us. So let's unpack these a bit. First, there's the fear of commitment. It's that pressure of fully committing to something big, like a project or a goal. Sometimes it feels easier to not even start than to face the possibility of failing or feeling completely overwhelmed.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I've definitely felt that pressure before. Okay, so what about the fear of the unknown?
This one is all about avoiding situations where we don't know the outcome. It could be starting a new job, moving to a new city, or even just trying a new recipe. The fear of the unknown keeps us clinging to what's familiar, even if it's not really serving us anymore.
Right, it's like that comfort zone can feel so cozy, even if it's getting a little cramped. So then there's the fear of discomfort. That one definitely resonates with me.
This one is about avoiding those things that bring up, uncomfortable feelings. It could be having a difficult conversation, confronting a weakness, or just pushing ourselves outside our comfort zone.
Yeah, I think a lot of procrastination really boils down to wanting to avoid those icky feelings, even if it means staying stuck.
Absolutely. And then finally, there's the fear of decision making. This one can be sneaky because it often hides behind things like being busy or indecisive. But at its core, it's about avoiding the responsibility of making a choice and potentially making the wrong one.
So we've got these 4 fears lurking in the shadows, ready to sabotage us at every turn. Fear of commitment, the unknown, discomfort, and decision-making. But what's the solution? Does the book just tell us to face our fears and be done with it?
It's a bit more nuanced than that. Instead of running from discomfort, he actually encourages us to lean into it. He argues that discomfort is a temporary step towards growth, a necessary part of the process.
So it's not about seeking out suffering, but recognizing that growth happens outside of that comfy, cozy comfort zone.
Exactly. And he doesn't just leave us hanging with a pep talk. He provides this really practical system for overcoming procrastination. One example is the 5-minute rule.
Oh yeah, I've heard of that one. It's about starting small, right?
Right. It's about committing to just 5 minutes of focused effort on a task, just to break through that initial resistance.
5 minutes, I can handle that, even for a master procrastinator like myself. But what happens if after those 5 minutes I still don't want to continue?
That's a great question. What often happens is once we get over that initial hurdle, that inertia, we start to build momentum. Our brains love to conserve energy, so starting anything new feels hard. But once we're in motion, it's actually easier to keep going than to stop.
It's like that saying, objects in motion tend to stay in motion.
Yes.
The book also talks about using visualization techniques, right?
Absolutely. By vividly picturing ourselves completing a task successfully, we're actually priming our minds for action. It's like athletes who mentally rehearse their performance before a competition. It's the same principle.
So it's not just about willpower. It's about using the power of our minds to make things happen.
Exactly. And the book goes into even more practical techniques, which I think we should definitely explore in the next part of our deep dive. But before we move on, there's one more concept I want to touch on. Closing open loops.
Ooh, yes. I remember that phrase.
Yeah.
It's about finishing what we start, right?
Exactly. Open loops are those unfinished tasks that just kind of linger in the back of our minds, like browser tabs we never close. They create mental clutter and anxiety and drain our energy and focus. So the book really emphasizes the importance of completing tasks, not just for the sense of accomplishment, but to free up that mental bandwidth.
I love that analogy. It's like having a million tabs open in your brain and everything's running super slow. So by closing those loops, we're essentially decluttering our minds and making space for the things that really matter.
That's exactly it. And that leads us perfectly into the next part of our deep dive, where we'll explore some of the practical strategies for tackling those hard things and actually getting them done.
All right, so we've uncovered some of the sneaky psychology behind procrastination and even dipped our toes into a few strategies. But now it's time to roll up our sleeves and get down to the nitty-gritty. What are some of the practical tools that Alan gives us for actually making a change? I'm ready for some action.
I love it. And Alan definitely delivers on that practical front. He lays out a system that really starts with taking radical ownership of our behavior.
So it's more than just acknowledging that we procrastinate. It's about taking responsibility for it.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we have the power to choose how we respond to challenges, instead of playing the blame game or making excuses.
Okay, so no more pointing fingers at external factors. It's about recognizing our own role in this whole procrastination dance.
Right. And it starts with making a conscious decision to change. But it's not about beating ourselves up for past procrastination. It's more about self-forgiveness and a willingness to learn and grow.
I like that. It's about approaching this with a clean slate and a healthy dose of self-compassion. Not getting stuck in a cycle of guilt and shame.
Exactly. And once we've kind of shifted our mindset, the next step is to actually face those things that we've been putting off. He calls it creating an anti-procrastination list, which can sound a bit daunting, I know.
Yeah, time to face those skeletons in the closet.
Yeah.
But where do we even begin? My list could be a mile long.
I hear you. That's why he suggests keeping it short. No more than 10 items just to avoid feeling overwhelmed. These can be unfinished tasks projects, even those little broken things around the house that we keep meaning to fix.
So breaking it down into bite-sized pieces instead of staring at a mountain of to-dos.
Exactly. And once we have that list, it's time for a bold move. It's not about deciding to do it someday or later. It's about deciding to do it now.
No more excuses. But how do we actually make that commitment stick? I mean, it's easy to say we're going to do something, but actually following through is a whole other story.
That's true. That's why he recommends writing down our commitment, and not just once, but 5 times. It sounds a bit strange, but that repetition really reinforces the intention and makes it more likely that we'll follow through.
I guess it's like signing a contract with ourselves, making it official. But then what? Do we just dive headfirst into the most daunting task on our list?
Not necessarily. Remember the 5-minute rule we talked about? This is where it comes in handy. Even just committing to 5 minutes of focused effort is enough to break through that initial resistance and start building momentum.
It's like getting the ball rolling. Once it's in motion, it's easier to keep it going. But what if those 5 minutes are up and I'm still feeling stuck?
Well, that's where another strategy comes into play. Alan suggests telling someone about our intentions. Could be for a family member or even an accountability partner. By sharing our goals, we actually increase the chances that we'll follow through. It's like having someone in our corner cheering us on.
Yeah, it's about adding that layer of external accountability to support our internal motivation. And I remember the book also talked about scheduling those hard things, right?
Absolutely. Putting those tasks on our calendars makes them non-negotiable. We're not waiting for free time to magically appear. We're making the time.
No more. I'll get to it when I have a chance. It's about actually blocking out that time and treating it like an important appointment. But let's be honest, even with the best intentions and a fancy schedule, sometimes those old procrastination habits creep back in. What about those moments when we find ourselves slipping back into avoidance mode?
Well, it happens. Nobody's perfect, and Alan acknowledges that. He really emphasizes self-compassion in those moments. It's not about beating ourselves up for those slip-ups, but rather acknowledging them, learning from them, and getting back on track.
So being a kind and supportive coach to ourselves, rather than a drill sergeant. But what about those sneaky distractions that pop up throughout the day? I feel like I'm constantly battling the urge to check my phone or get sidetracked by something shiny and new.
You've hit upon another key element that Alan addresses, the power of our environment. He encourages us to create a space that supports our goals by minimizing distractions.
So procrastination-proof zone. But how do we actually do that?
It starts by identifying and eliminating those negative triggers, those things in our environment that tempt us to procrastinate. It might be having our phone constantly within reach, or a cluttered workspace that triggers feelings of overwhelm. So think about those things that pull you off track and see if you can minimize their presence.
Okay, so if I'm constantly tempted to scroll through social media, maybe I need to put my phone in another room while I'm working. And if clutter makes me feel overwhelmed, maybe a good decluttering session is in order.
Exactly. And it's not just about removing the negative, it's also about adding in the positive. He talks about incorporating cues for action into our environment. It might be placing motivational quotes or images in our workspace, or using visual reminders of our goals, even just setting up our space in a way that makes it easier to engage in those habits that we're trying to cultivate.
So if I want to make exercise a regular habit, maybe I lay out my workout clothes the night before, so there's one less barrier in the morning.
That's a perfect example. It's about making those positive choices the path of least resistance.
This is all making so much sense. But let's be real. Sometimes, even with the best environment and a perfectly organized schedule, doing those hard things can feel hard.
Absolutely. And that's why Alan emphasizes the importance of rewarding ourselves for completing those challenging tasks, both big and small. It's about acknowledging our efforts and making the process a little more enjoyable.
I am all about celebrating those wins, no matter how big or small. But what are some good ways to incorporate rewards into this whole procrastination busting plan?
It really can be anything that you genuinely enjoy. Taking a break to do something fun, indulging in a favorite treat, planning a special outing or experience. The key is to link those rewards to your accomplishments. So you're creating this positive feedback loop that reinforces those behaviors that you're trying to cultivate.
So it's like giving ourselves a little pat on the back for a job well done. Making those hard things feel a little less hard.
Exactly. It's about recognizing our efforts and appreciating how far we've come.
But I'm curious, does Alan address those moments when we get stuck in overthinking and analysis paralysis? That could be a major form of procrastination for me.
That's a great question, and one that Alan tackles head on. In fact, he has some really fascinating insights into how our brains work and specific tactics for overcoming those mental roadblocks. And that's precisely what we'll be delving into in the final part of our deep dive.
All right, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into Scott Allen's Do the Hard Things First. And I'm really excited to dig into what he says about those mental roadblocks we often face. Those moments when overthinking and analysis paralysis just completely take over. It's like procrastination disguised as productivity.
It is, isn't it? It's amazing how our brains can trick us into thinking we're making progress when we're actually just spinning our wheels.
Exactly. So how does Alan tackle these mental traps? Does he give us any strategies for becoming like procrastination fighting ninjas?
He does. And he starts by addressing those pesky little things he calls impulse snaps. These are those sudden urges that kind of pull us away from our work, like that craving to check social media or, the siren song of online shopping.
Oh, tell me about it. Impulse snaps are my kryptonite. One minute I'm laser focused on a task and the next I'm down a rabbit hole of cute cat videos. It's like my willpower just vanishes.
Well, the key, Alan says, is to interrupt those impulse snaps before they can completely hijack our focus. He suggests adding a little delay before we indulge. So let's say you feel that urge to check your phone. Take 5 deep breaths first. Or if you're about to open a new browser tab, count to 10 before you give in. It's about creating that space between the urge and the action.
Oh, that makes sense. Like hitting the pause button on autopilot and giving ourselves a chance to actually make a conscious choice.
Exactly. And he also emphasizes using breathing techniques for managing those moments of temptation. You know, those deep, slow breaths, they can really help calm the nervous system and bring us back to the present moment, which makes it much easier to resist those impulsive urges.
Oh yeah, finding those little moments of zen amidst all the chaos. I like it. But what about that other sneaky culprit? The one Alan refers to as shiny object syndrome.
Ah, yes, SOS, the irresistible allure of the new and shiny. This is that tendency we have to get distracted by the latest trends or tools or information, often at the expense of the work that really matters. It's that feeling that if we just had that one new gadget or signed up for that one new course, everything would magically fall into place.
Oh, I am so guilty of this. It's like being a kid in a candy store, but instead of candy, it's productivity apps and online courses. I'm always convinced that the next shiny thing is going to be the key to unlocking my ultimate productivity potential.
Right. Well, the antidote, Alan says, is to be mindful of our research time, recognizing when we're genuinely looking for helpful information versus when we're just procrastinating in disguise.
Yeah, sometimes more information isn't better. It's just a distraction.
Exactly. Focus on implementation rather than just accumulation. And he offers this really helpful strategy he calls the static method for dealing with those moments when SOS strikes.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What does static stand for?
It stands for Stop, Think, Argue, Stay, Revisit, and Complete. It's basically a step-by-step process for evaluating those shiny new opportunities before we jump in headfirst.
So it's about slowing down, taking a breath, and really asking ourselves some critical questions before we dive into that next shiny object.
Exactly. We can make more intentional choices and avoid those tempting distractions.
This is all great advice, but let's be real. Sometimes even with the best strategies in place, we still fall back into those old procrastination habits. What does Alan say about managing those inevitable setbacks? I know for me, it's easy to get discouraged and feel like I'm failing when I slip up.
He emphasizes the importance of self-compassion. It's not about beating ourselves up for those slip-ups, but rather, acknowledging them, learning from them, and getting back on track.
So like being a kind and supportive coach to ourselves, instead of that inner critic that's always so quick to judge.
Exactly. Setbacks are normal. It's how we respond to them that makes all the difference. And remember what we talked about earlier, the power of our environment. He really brings that back around when it comes to managing setbacks.
Right. So it's not just about managing our minds, it's also about creating a supportive environment.
Precisely. He reminds us to eliminate those negative triggers we talked about and surround ourselves with positive cues for action.
So if I'm working on a project and I feel myself getting overwhelmed, maybe I need to step away for a bit, go for a walk in nature to clear my head, or put on some upbeat music to boost my energy.
Those are great examples. It's all about finding what works for you and creating an environment that truly supports your goals.
And of course, we can't forget about rewards.
Yeah.
Who doesn't love a little celebration after tackling a tough task?
Absolutely. Alan emphasizes the importance of rewarding ourselves for those accomplishments, no matter how big or small. It's about acknowledging our efforts and making the whole process a little bit more enjoyable.
So it's not just about grit and discipline. It's also about recognizing and celebrating our progress. What are some good ways to incorporate rewards into this procrastination-busting plan?
Well, it can be anything you genuinely enjoy. Taking a break to do something fun, indulging in a favorite treat, planning a special outing. The key is to link those rewards to your accomplishments. That way you're creating that positive feedback loop that reinforces those desired behaviors.
So it's like giving ourselves a pat on the back for a job well done.
Yeah.
And making those hard things feel a little less hard.
Exactly. It's about acknowledging our efforts and appreciating how far we've come.
So we've covered so much ground today, from the psychology of procrastination to practical strategies for taking action and mastering those mental game tactics.
Yeah.
What would you say is the most important message for our listeners to take away from this deep dive?
I think the biggest takeaway is that procrastination isn't a character flaw, it's a habit. And like any habit, it can be changed. By understanding why we procrastinate, creating a solid plan, and using those mental game tactics we've talked about, we can break free from those patterns and achieve those goals.
It's about taking control of our minds and our lives, becoming those action-taking, goal-crushing individuals we're all capable of being. I don't know about you, but I'm feeling super inspired and ready to tackle those hard things head on.
That's the spirit. And remember, the power to change is within you. It's time to step into that power and create the life you truly desire.
That's a great place to wrap things up. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into Scott Allen's Do the Hard Things First. We hope you've gained some valuable insights and practical tools to conquer procrastination and unlock your full potential. Until next time, keep diving deep and keep doing those hard things.